The black-haired title stepmother made her sleep with the dogs every night 10 years later. She walked back in as a lawyer and evicted them all. Opening 3 brief high-stakes scenes. Action first. Hook. 00012. Scene 1. A confident, elegantly dressed young woman in a sharp black designer suit walks boldly through the iron gates of a luxurious family compound, her heels clicking against the polished stones like the steady beat of a war drum. She carries a thick brown envelope sealed with a red wax stamp. The cruel stepmother stands frozen on the wide veranda, her mouth open in total shock, hand trembling against the pillar she grips for support. The woman does not rush. She does not shout. She simply looks the stepmother directly in the eyes and declares, in a voice as cold and final as a coffin lid closing, 10 years of sleeping with dogs ends today. And everything you stole, I have come to collect. 012-028. Scene 2. Flashback. Pouring rain at night. Lightning slashes the sky. A terrified 14-year-old girl in a tattered school dress is dragged violently across the wet compound floor by her hair, mud coating her knees and palms. She screams and claws at the hands holding her, but she is too small, too weak. With a vicious shove, she is thrown headfirst into a rusted metal dog kennel at the back of the compound. The gate clangs shut. A thick chain is wrapped around the latch and locked. The stepmother stands outside with an umbrella, laughing slowly in the rain, her red lipstick glowing like a wound in the dark. "This is where dogs sleep," she says with a smile that belongs in a nightmare. "And from tonight, you are my dog." 028-045. Scene 3. Flash forward. Inside an Abuja High Court. Ceiling fans spin lazily. The gallery is packed. In the center of the courtroom, a striking young woman stands tall in lawyer's robes, her posture immovable as carved stone. Behind the defendant's table, an older man and woman sit hunched and weeping, the once feared stepmother and the cowardly father. The judge leans forward, adjusts his glasses, and reads from his ruling in a slow, deliberate voice. He picks up the gavel. The courtroom holds its breath. The gavel falls with a thunderclap. Eviction granted. Fraud proven. All properties, including the compound, the farmlands, and all registered assets, revert immediately to their rightful owner, Miss Zara Okoro. This court is adjourned. 045-058. Screen text voice over. If you are watching this right now, you already know karma always finds a way. If this kind of powerful justice story speaks to your soul, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to believe in redemption today. Subscribe to our channel with notifications turned on, because we drop powerful, true life-inspired revenge and redemption stories every single week. Every story we tell is for everyone who was ever underestimated, mistreated, and counted out. This one is especially for you. Now, let us go back to the very beginning. Let us tell you the full, complete, deeply true story of Zara Okoro, the girl they locked in a kennel, who came back and unlocked everything they owned. Chapter 1. When the world was still beautiful. To understand what Zara Okoro survived, you must first understand what she lost. In the quiet, tree-lined village of Umuahia in Abia State, there existed a household that most children in the surrounding compounds quietly envied. Chief Emmanuel Okoro was not a small man, not in height, not in reputation, and certainly not in wealth. He had built his palm oil business from almost nothing, starting as a young man who carried heavy cans on a bicycle to market. By the time Zara was born, Chief Okoro owned 3 large warehouses, multiple hectares of productive farmland, a fleet of delivery trucks, and a wide, beautiful compound with red-painted walls and an enormous mango tree in the center that children climbed on lazy Sunday afternoons. But none of that, not the trucks, not the land, not the warehouses, was what made Zara's world beautiful. What made her world beautiful was her mother. Mrs. Adiz Okoro was the kind of woman that people remembered long after she left a room. She had a laugh that filled the entire compound, a warmth in her eyes that never dimmed, and hands that were always busy either braiding her daughter's hair, stirring something fragrant on the fire, or reaching out to comfort whoever needed comfort. She was educated, graceful, deeply kind, and completely devoted to her only child. Every night without fail, she would wrap Zara in a cloth on her lap and sing Igbo lullabies in a low, honeyed voice until the child's eyes grew heavy and closed. "You are my morning and my evening," Adiz would whisper. "As long as I breathe, nothing in this world will ever harm you." Zara was 8 years old when her world collapsed. It happened on a rainy evening in October. Adiz had complained of a severe headache for 3 days, nothing unusual. She had always been prone to stress-related tension. But this time, she collapsed suddenly in the kitchen while preparing dinner. Neighbors rushed her to the local hospital. The doctors worked through the night. Chief Okoro sat in the corridor with his fists pressed to his mouth, rocking back and forth. By morning, Adiz was gone. A massive brain aneurysm. Fast, without warning, without mercy. Zara was brought to the hospital by a neighbor. She was handed her mother's headscarf, the one Adiz had been wearing when she fell, and told simply that Mama had gone to be with God. The little girl stood in the hospital corridor holding that headscarf for hours. She did not cry immediately. She was too confused for tears. She kept waiting for someone to tell her it was a mistake. Nobody did. The weeks that followed were the quietest of Zara's life. Chief Okoro went through the motions of burial and mourning, but something in him seemed to shudder like a window closing. He had loved his wife deeply, but grief made him retreat inward rather than reach outward. He threw himself back into business almost immediately, traveling, attending meetings, staying away from the compound for weeks at a time. When he was home, he barely spoke. He would sit in the main parlor, stare at his phone, and wave Zara away when she came to hug him. Zara learned to be quiet. She learned to take up less space. She clung to the headscarf and slept with it every night, pressing it to her face so she could still find the faint trace of her mother's perfume. She told herself her mother's smell was still there. For months, she told herself that. 3 months after Adiz's burial, Chief Okoro came home from Lagos with a woman no one in the compound had ever seen before. Her name was Victoria Chukwu. She was from Enugu, tall, dramatically dressed in Ankara that was just a little too loud, with long fake nails painted the color of fresh blood, and a perfume so strong it entered rooms before she did. She smiled at everything and everyone, her teeth very white, her laughter very frequent and very sharp. She shook the hands of the compound workers, complimented the neighbors, gave the gateman a generous tip, and bent down to little Zara's level with a smile so wide it seemed to strain the edges of her face. "You must be Zara," she said sweetly. "Your father has told me so much about you. I'm going to take very good care of you, my darling." Zara stared at her. Something about the woman's eyes unsettled her, even then not cruelty exactly, but a sort of calculating emptiness behind the warmth, the way a shop window can look inviting without actually being warm. Chief Okoro announced that evening at dinner that Victoria was to be his new wife. There would be a quiet traditional ceremony the following month. Victoria would move in immediately. The compound workers exchanged careful glances. The neighbors said polite, non-committal things. Nobody said what some of them thought, that it was too soon, that Adiz was barely cold in the ground, that something about this woman did not sit right. Nobody said anything. In Nigeria, in a wealthy man's compound, you did not tell the chief what to think. The first 3 weeks, Victoria performed brilliantly. She cooked, she cleaned, she laughed loudly at Chief Okoro's stories. She patted Zara's head and brought her small presents: a packet of biscuits, a plastic bangle, a pencil case. Zara remained cautious, polite, and distant. She kept her mother's headscarf beneath her pillow. Then Chief Okoro left for a 2-week business trip to Port Harcourt. The front door had barely closed behind his car before Victoria's face changed. The biscuits stopped, the bangles stopped, the soft voice stopped. Victoria walked into the kitchen where Zara was eating her breakfast, sat across from her, folded her long hands on the table, and looked at the child the way a landlord looks at a sitting tenant they plan to evict. "From today," she said, each word dropped like a stone into still water, "you will learn your place in this house. Your mother is dead. Your father belongs to me. And this compound, everything in it, every wall, every room, every piece of furniture, all of it belongs to me now. Is that clear?" Zara stared at her. "This is my mother's house," she said quietly. The slap came so fast Zara barely saw it move. Her face snapped sideways. Her biscuit fell to the floor. "Wrong answer," Victoria said calmly, standing up and smoothing her wrapper. "Your mother is gone. Nothing here belongs to a dead woman. Now get up, wash these dishes, and sweep every room before noon. If I find one spot of dust, you will not eat tonight." That was the first day of a life Zara would spend a decade trying to survive. Chapter 2: The Architecture of Cruelty. 7/30/1520. Victoria Chukwu was not a woman who did cruelty carelessly. She was systematic about it, organized, patient, and creative in ways that suggested she had thought about this long before she arrived. Within a single month of becoming Mrs. Okoro, she had restructured the entire compound in her favor with a cold efficiency that would have been admirable in a different context. The house staff who had served Chief Okoro's family for years were quietly replaced, dismissed one by one with thin excuses. The cook who had known Adiz was told her services were no longer required. The older gateman who had watched Zara grow up from infancy was replaced with a much younger man who came from Victoria's own hometown, and whose loyalty therefore lay entirely with her. The compound cleaner, the night guard, the market woman who delivered groceries, all of them, gone within 6 weeks, replaced by people Victoria controlled. With the old staff gone, there was no one left in the compound who remembered Adiz, no one who had any loyalty to the child she left behind. Zara became completely isolated, surrounded by strangers who either pitied her quietly or learned quickly that it was safer not to notice her at all. What Victoria did next was worse. She pulled Zara out of school. Zara had been doing well, very well, in fact. Her class teacher had sent home a note the previous term saying that Zara showed exceptional promise in reading and comprehension. Her mathematics scores were among the highest in her class, but none of that mattered to Victoria. Education, in Victoria's calculation, was a form of power, and a powerless Zara was a useful Zara. "School is over for you," Victoria told her flatly one morning, burning the note from Zara's teacher in the kitchen fire without even reading it. "You will work in this compound. That is your school from now on." She collected every textbook, every notebook, every pencil, and every school uniform Zara owned and burned them all in the backyard. Zara stood and watched the fire eat her future, her hands pressed tightly against her sides, her jaw locked to stop herself from screaming. The workload Victoria assigned her was designed for an adult, not a child. Zara was 8 when this began. She woke every morning before the rooster crowed at 4:30, sometimes 4, to begin fetching water from the stream 2 compounds away. She cooked breakfast, washed dishes, scrubbed floors on her hands and knees, washed clothes by hand in a concrete basin until her small fingers cracked and bled, and went to the market on foot carrying loads that bent her small frame sideways. If she finished quickly and sat down to rest, Victoria would find new work. If she worked slowly, she was beaten. If she spilled anything, she was beaten. If she was heard crying, she was beaten harder to give her something real to cry about. Victoria beat her with anything that was near a wooden spoon, a rubber sandal, a thin cane kept specifically for this purpose on the top of the refrigerator. Chief Okoro saw all of it. He would sit in the parlor reading his newspaper or watching the news while Zara scrubbed the floor around his feet. Sometimes he would glance down at her. Their eyes would meet for a moment and he would look away. Back to the newspaper, back to the television, back to Victoria's world which had fully swallowed his. "She needs discipline," Victoria would tell him pleasantly whenever he seemed on the verge of asking a question. "You spoiled her too much before. She is becoming strong now. You should be thanking me." And Chief Okoro, this man who had once built an empire from bicycle deliveries, this respected merchant who sat on community councils and was addressed as chief by grown men, this man would nod slowly and say nothing. Zara stopped trying to appeal to him after her 9th birthday. She had knocked on his bedroom door that evening, wanting simply to be wished a happy birthday, wanting some small recognition that she existed as his daughter and not merely as a servant. Victoria opened the door instead. She looked at Zara for a long moment with her head tilted. "Why are you disturbing Chief?" she asked quietly. "Today is my birthday," Zara said. Victoria stepped outside the door, pulling it partly closed behind her, and leaned down close to Zara's face. "Your birthday is not a holiday in this house," she whispered. "Go back to work." She shut the door. Zara stood in the corridor alone for a long time. Then she walked to the kitchen, picked up the remaining dishes from dinner, and washed them in silence while the compound slept around her. The kennel began when Zara was 10 years old. The compound had 2 large German Shepherd dogs, Brutus and King, kept at the back of the property to guard against intruders. They slept in a large metal kennel, well built and strongly locked with a heavy-duty chain. Victoria had always used them as tools of intimidation, releasing them into the compound at night so no one moved around freely. One evening, Zara dropped and broke a ceramic plate while washing dishes. It was an accident. Her hands were still wet and the plate slipped, but accidents had no grace period in Victoria's house. That night, Victoria dragged her by the ear to the back of the compound. "Since you want to behave like an animal," Victoria said, her voice frighteningly calm, "you will sleep like one." She locked Zara in the kennel with Brutus and King, chained the gate, and walked away. That first night, Zara pressed herself into the far corner of the kennel, rigid with terror, convinced the dogs would tear her apart. But Brutus simply walked over, sniffed her thoroughly, and lay down beside her. King followed. The warmth of their large bodies against hers was the only thing that kept her from shaking apart entirely. It was supposed to be a single punishment. It became a permanent arrangement. From that night onward, Victoria declared that Zara would sleep in the kennel every night. At exactly 8 o'clock, Zara would be locked in. The dogs would be locked in with her. The chain would go on the gate. Victoria would return with the key at 5 in the morning to let her out in time to begin the day's work. The kennel was not designed for a human being. It was damp, smelled of dog and urine, and turned bitterly cold at night during the harmattan season. During the rainy season, water crept in through the gaps at the base and soaked everything: her clothes, her skin, the thin mat she eventually managed to keep there as bedding. Mosquitoes were relentless. She had no mosquito net. She had no change of clothes to sleep in. She had no light. She had only Brutus and King, who pressed themselves close to her every night without fail, their warm breath steady against her cold arms. "At least you two don't hate me," she would whisper to them in the dark. And somehow the soft thump of a tail against the kennel floor was enough to keep her going until morning. Chief Okoro knew about the kennel. The compound workers knew. The neighbors 2 fences away could sometimes hear Victoria's voice at night giving her instructions at the gate. Nobody said anything to anyone official. In a community where a wealthy man's wife ran his household, in a culture where outsiders did not interfere with how a man disciplined those under his roof, Zara was simply invisible, a child-shaped ghost that people looked past rather than at. She had no one. She was utterly alone. But inside her mind, a place Victoria's cruelty could not enter, Zara was doing something remarkable. She was fighting back in the only way available to her. She was refusing to let her mind die. Chapter 3: The Library in the Darkness. 15/2023 40. 2 compounds away from the Okoro gate lived a woman named Mama Ngozi, or, as she was properly known to the parents of the village, Mrs. Ngozi Okonkwo. a retired schoolteacher who had spent 35 years teaching English and civics at the local government secondary school before her knees gave out and forced her into retirement. She was in her late 60s now, small and slightly bent. With gray-white hair she kept in a neat bun and reading glasses perpetually perched on the end of her nose. She grew tomatoes and garden eggs in her small yard. She read 2 newspapers every day. She kept a house full of books, shelves of them, stacked on the floor, piled on tables, arranged by subject along every wall. Mama Ngozi had watched the Okoro compound the way watchful older neighbors always do, through the gaps of compound walls, through overheard sounds, through the quiet calculations of an experienced human being who has seen many things in many years. She had noticed the child. She had noticed what was being done to the child. The opportunity came on a Tuesday morning when Victoria sent Zara to the market alone, for the first time, a mercy born not of kindness, but of laziness. Victoria's own legs were tired, the market was far, and Zara was old enough to carry the load. On her way back from the market, Zara passed Mama Ngozi's gate. The old woman was outside watering her tomato plants and called out to offer the heavily loaded girl a glass of water. Zara stopped. She put down the bags. She drank the water, which was cold and clean and tasted like the most generous thing anyone had offered her in years. Mama Ngozi watched her over the rim of her own glass. "You are Chief Okoro's daughter," the old woman said. It was not a question. "Yes, Ma," Zara said. "Are you going to school?" A pause. "No, Ma." "Why not?" Zara said nothing. Her jaw tightened slightly. Mama Ngozi set down her watering can. "Would you like to come inside for a moment? I have chin-chin." Inside the small, book-crowded sitting room, something changed in Zara. She sat on the edge of the old woman's chair and stared at the walls of books around her with an expression of naked hunger that Mama Ngozi would later describe to a friend as the most heartbreaking and the most beautiful thing I have ever seen on a child's face. "Can I touch one?" Zara asked. "You can touch as many as you like," Mama Ngozi said. Zara picked up a book. It was a thick secondary school English textbook, Form 2 level. She opened it slowly, carefully, like someone handling a relic. She ran her finger across a paragraph. Her lips moved silently. "You can read," Mama Ngozi said, surprised. "My mother taught me," Zara said, "before she died." Mama Ngozi was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Come back next Tuesday. Come after the market. Don't tell anyone where you are going." From that Tuesday onward, Zara's mind became the most fiercely guarded secret in her life. Every time she had an errand that took her past Mama Ngozi's compound, the market, the stream, the grinding machine, she stopped for 30 minutes, an hour when she could risk it. The old woman taught her with the disciplined patience of someone who had spent decades making knowledge accessible to children who struggled. But Zara did not struggle. She consumed. She absorbed information with a ferocious intensity that startled even the experienced teacher. "Read this section," Mama Ngozi would say. And Zara would read it once, close her eyes, and repeat it back, not word for word, but completely, correctly, in her own ordered language, as though she were reading from a book inside her head. "Do you forget things easily?" Mama Ngozi asked her once. "I never forget anything," Zara said simply. It was not boasting. It was a precise, accurate description of what her mind did. The memory that Victoria assumed was a blank canvas had been quietly becoming a masterwork. She studied English composition and comprehension. She learned the grammar rules, not by rote but by understanding their logic and internal structure. She studied mathematics, fractions, algebra, geometry, sitting on the floor of the old woman's sitting room with a borrowed notebook she left behind at Mama Ngozi's house every time because she could not risk Victoria finding it. She studied history, geography, and biology with equal appetite. But the subject that captured Zara's mind, most completely, the one that made her lean forward with her elbows on her knees and her eyes bright was law. Mama Ngozi had several law books from her nephew, who had studied at University of Nigeria decades ago. The Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, the Property and Conveyancing Law, the Child Rights Act, the Wills Act. Zara read them all, and what she read rearranged something inside her. Because she began to understand slowly at first, then with gathering certainty that there were rules in the world. There were laws, there were rights, and some of those rights, no matter how deeply buried under a stepmother's cruelty or a father's cowardice, could not actually be taken away. They had to be surrendered or stolen, and what was stolen could potentially be recovered. She memorized sections of the Nigerian Constitution in the kennel at night, whispering them to herself while Brutus and King breathed warmly against her arms. She repeated definitions of property law in the dark, working through logical arguments in her head the way other children worked through arithmetic problems. She built cases in her mind, arguments, counterarguments, supporting evidence, conclusions. Victoria would sometimes appear at the kennel gate late at night and shine a torch inside, searching for hidden contraband, books, paper, anything that suggested Zara was educating herself. She found nothing. She never would. Everything lived in Zara's head. "You have a gift," Mama Ngozi told her one afternoon, tears standing unexpectedly in the old woman's eyes. "An extraordinary, once-in-a-generation gift, and those people are trying to bury it alive." "They won't succeed," Zara said. Her voice at 14 was quiet, but it carried something beneath it, not anger exactly, but a quality of settled, immovable intention that made Mama Ngozi straighten up in her chair. "No," the old woman agreed softly. "I don't believe they will." That same year, Zara memorized the sections of Nigerian property law that dealt with inheritance rights, the transfer of assets belonging to deceased parents, and the legal standing of a minor as a named beneficiary in a will or a registered property title. She filed the knowledge carefully inside her internal library, cross-referenced, organized, and waiting. She did not yet know exactly what she would do with it, but she knew with absolute certainty that the day would come when she would need it. She was right. Chapter 4: The Conversation Behind the Wall. 23-40-31-10. Zara's 16th birthday came and went without a single person in the compound acknowledging it. No cake, no song, no kind word, not even the meaningless acknowledgement Victoria had offered those first few weeks of performance. By 16, Zara had been stripped so completely of her personhood within that compound that her birthday passing unnoticed felt almost normal. She marked it herself in the kennel that night by reciting to Brutus and King every section of the Child Rights Act she had memorized. It felt fitting. What happened 4 days later changed everything. The afternoon was hot and still. Chief Okoro had returned from a business trip 2 days before and was home, which meant the compound moved at a slightly different rhythm, quieter, more careful. Victoria was always on her best behavior when Chief Okoro was watching. She spoke to Zara with her teeth showing in something that resembled a smile when he was present, then dropped the pretense the moment his back was turned. Zara was moving through the narrow corridor beside the main storage room, carrying a basin of washed clothes to hang on the line at the back, when she heard voices in the sitting room, low, private, intense. The storage room shared a thin wall with the side parlor. Zara had hung the clothes on that line 1,000 times. She knew every sound that passed through that wall. She set down the basin silently and stood absolutely still. "The problem is timing," Victoria was saying, her voice stripped of its social performance, flat and businesslike. "We need to be careful." "I know," Chief Okoro said. He sounded tired. He always sounded tired now. "She turns 18 in 2 years. Once she is 18, she becomes a legal adult and can claim full ownership independently. We cannot allow that to happen." A pause, the clink of glasses. "But if we move too early, there are questions, community questions. You know how these people talk." Victoria. Listen to me." Her voice sharpened. Her mother's will was very specific. Everything, the houses in Umuahia and Aba, the palm oil farmlands, the business shares, the investment accounts, all of it was registered in a D's name and transferred to Zara as sole beneficiary. Your name is not on a single document. Do you understand what that means? Silence. It means that without Zara's signature as an adult, we cannot sell, transfer, or liquidate any of it. We are sitting in a house we technically do not own. We have been spending profits from a business that does not legally belong to us. Her voice dropped lower. When she turns 18, all she has to do is walk into a law office and we lose everything. She doesn't even know any of this, Chief Okoro said. You are certain of that? She has never been to school. She cannot read documents. She knows nothing about property law. People in her situation have surprised smarter men than you, Victoria said sharply. I'm not willing to assume. The plan is simple. We keep her here, keep her manageable, and the moment she turns 18, we bring in the lawyers, we tell her whatever story we need to tell her to make her sign, and we move everything into our names. Transfer the properties, sell the farmlands, liquidate the business accounts. Then we relocate to Lagos. Another silence, longer this time. And after that, Chief Okoro asked. Victoria's answer came slowly, deliberately, each word chosen and placed with the care of someone who had been rehearsing this conversation in their head for months. Accidents happen, a manual. Young women make poor decisions. They run away. They get into trouble. The world is very dangerous for a girl who has no one looking out for her. The sitting room went completely quiet. She is my daughter, Chief Okoro said. His voice had dropped to something barely audible. She is a problem, Victoria replied, that we are solving together, as we have always done. Zara stood in the corridor for a long time after the voices stopped. The basin of wet clothes sat at her feet, forgotten. Her hands, pressed flat against the wall, were completely steady. Her breathing was slow and measured. Later, she would not be able to explain why she did not cry immediately. She thought perhaps there was simply no room for tears inside the enormity of what she now understood. They had never planned to keep her. They had planned to use her weight until her usefulness peaked at 18, extract the signature that would strip her of everything her mother had built and left for her, and then make her disappear. Her own father had sat in a room and agreed to this. The man who had held her hand at her mother's grave had agreed, without much resistance, to the plan to erase her from the earth. That night in the kennel, Zara did not repeat law passages or memorize new material. She lay with Brutus pressed against her back and stared at the rusted ceiling above her head for many hours. Then she began to plan. Not revenge, not yet. First, survival, then escape, then something larger, something that would take years to build but would ultimately be unassailable. She began assembling in her mind a strategy so detailed, so legally grounded, and so patient in its construction that it would have impressed the most senior partner at any law firm in the country. She was 16 years old, locked in a dog kennel, and she was coming for everything they had taken. Chapter 5: The Filing of the Iron. 31-10-38-50. From the night of the overheard conversation, Zara began preparing with the focused urgency of someone who knows exactly how much time they have left and has calculated precisely what must be done in that time. The first task was acquiring a tool. The compound had a small outdoor workshop, a roofed concrete space where the gateman stored tools for minor repairs. Zara had cleaned it many times and knew its contents intimately. On a high shelf, behind cans of paint thinner and a rusted bicycle chain, sat a small metal file, the kind used for sharpening garden cutlasses. It was old and slightly bent, but its teeth were still intact. Over the course of 3 separate visits to the workshop during her cleaning duties, Zara removed the file in 3 careful stages, first loosening it from behind the cans, then repositioning it near the edge, then finally palming it on her 3rd visit and hiding it inside her brassiere as she walked back through the compound. Nobody saw. Nobody looked. She hid the file in a specific gap between two concrete blocks in the kennel wall that she had discovered months earlier. A hollow just large enough to conceal something small, covered naturally by a flap of old kennel flooring. Then she began to study the chain. Every night for 2 weeks, she examined the chain and padlock Victoria used on the kennel gate. She worked by feel in the darkness, running her fingers over the links, learning the weight and thickness, identifying the weakest point, not the padlock, which was solid, but one specific link near the hasp where two sections met, where years of rust and moisture had created a barely visible seam of structural weakness. She did not rush. Rushing was for people without plans. She waited 3 more weeks watching the household patterns, timing Victoria's movements, noting the precise hours when the gateman made his rounds, when the compound went fully quiet, when the neighbor's dog, the real, and only guard she needed to worry about, settled into sleep. She mapped the hours with the precision of someone who had spent years in a kennel learning to read nighttime by sound. The opportunity she needed, finally, came on a dry Saturday in March. Victoria announced that she and Chief Okoro would be attending a 4-day wedding celebration in Enugu, a relative ceremony that apparently required their full and extended presence. They would leave Saturday morning. They would return Tuesday evening. The compound would be left in the care of the new gateman, a young man named Chukwudi, who was reliable in that he locked the main gate faithfully every night, but who also reliably fell into a heavy sleep by 10:30 and could not be woken by anything short of an alarm. Zara heard this information on a Wednesday. She used the remaining days to finalize her plan. She said goodbye to Brutus and King on Saturday afternoon while cleaning the kennel, speaking to them quietly and at length, scratching behind their ears the way they liked. They leaned into her hands with their full weight. She had spent more nights beside these animals than she had spent in any bed. They had never once hurt her. In a household full of humans who had chosen to harm her, the dogs had chosen to keep her warm. "You will be okay," she whispered to them. "Someone will feed you. I am sorry I cannot stay." King licked her wrist once slowly. She sat with them for a long time. At 10:45 that Saturday night, when the compound had been silent for more than 30 minutes and Chukwudi's snoring was clearly audible from the gatehouse, Zara retrieved the metal file from its hiding place in the kennel wall. She worked in complete darkness, by touch alone. She positioned the file against the weakened link she had identified, pressed firmly, and began moving it in slow, steady strokes, careful to stay consistent, careful to maintain pressure without creating noise, careful to rest when her arms ached rather than rush and slip. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, the link gave way. Not dramatically, not with a snap. It simply separated quietly, a small metallic sigh in the silence of the compound, and the chain fell loose in her hands. Zara stood at the open kennel gate for a moment, breathing. The night air outside smelled of dust and distant rain, and something that might have been freedom. She pressed her feet against the compound soil, the soil she had scrubbed and swept and watered and suffered on for 8 years, and felt it solidly under her bare soles. Then she walked, barefoot in torn clothes, carrying nothing in her hands because everything she needed was inside her head. She crossed the dark compound, moved along the wall toward the side gate that could be unlatched from the inside, and slipped out into the road. She did not look back at the kennel. She ran. Chapter 6. Barefoot into the dark. 38, 50, 45, 30. The road outside the compound at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night in Umuahia was not empty, but it was quiet. A few motorcycles moved in the distance. A food vendor's fire burned at a junction 200 meters away. Zara moved quickly but deliberately, not sprinting, because a running girl at this hour would attract attention, but walking with the focused, purposeful stride of someone who had somewhere to be and the right to be there. Mama Ngozi's compound was 8 minutes away at a normal pace. Zara covered it in 5. She knocked on the old woman's side gate 3 knocks, A pause, two more a signal they had agreed on months earlier. On a day when Zara had whispered to the old woman, "If I ever come in the night, will you open?" And Mama Ngozi had looked at her steadily and said simply, "Yes." The gate opened within 2 minutes. Mama Ngozi stood in the doorway in her nightgown, her reading glasses already on her face as though she had been awake and reading. She took one look at Zara, the torn clothes, the bare feet, the cuts on her hands from the metal file, and said nothing except, "Come inside." She brought water. She brought food, a bowl of leftover oaf onigbu and Gary that Zara ate in silence, while Mama Ngozi sat across from her and watched with the expression of someone managing their own emotions with great care. "Tonight?" Mama Ngozi asked when the bowl was empty. "Tonight," Zara confirmed. Mama Ngozi nodded once, went to her bedroom, and returned with a clean dress, a pair of flat sandals, a small amount of money wrapped in a handkerchief, and an envelope. Inside the envelope were three things: a handwritten letter of introduction addressed to a couple in Abuja, friends of Mama Ngozi's, nephew, a photocopy of Zara's birth certificate that Mama Ngozi had quietly obtained from the local government registry 6 months earlier when she saw this night coming, and a small card with an address and phone number written in the old woman's neat, careful hand. "I prepared this 6 months ago," Mama Ngozi said quietly. "I have been waiting." Zara stared at the old woman. "You knew I would leave." "I knew you would have to, and I knew when you were ready you would not wait for permission." Mama Ngozi reached across and held Zara's damaged hands in both of hers. Her grip was surprisingly firm for such small, old hands. "There is a night bus to Abuja. It leaves from the motor park at 12:30. You have time." Mama Ngozi, Zara's voice, steady through everything, finally cracked at its edges. "I don't know how to." "You do not need to say anything," the old woman interrupted firmly. "You owe me nothing. You owe this village nothing. What you owe is to yourself and to your mother's memory. Now go and become what they spent 10 years trying to prevent." She stood up, walked Zara to her gate, embraced her once firmly, thoroughly, the embrace of someone who understood this was a final goodbye, and whispered against her ear words that Zara would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Run far, my child. Study hard. Learn the law that protects you. And when you return, and you will return so unstoppable that even the ground shakes when you walk on it." Zara stepped through the gate and onto the dark road. She did not look back at Mama Ngozi's house, either. She had learned by now that looking back cost something you needed for moving forward. The motor park was crowded in the way Nigerian motor parks always are at night, loud, lit by generator-powered fluorescent lights, smelling of diesel and suya, and too many people in too little space. Zara bought a seat on the Abuja-bound luxury bus with the money from the handkerchief. She sat by the window, held the envelope in her lap, and watched Umuahia disappear behind the bus. She was 16 years old, alone, barefoot in borrowed sandals, heading to a city she had never visited, with an address on a card and a head full of law books. She had nothing that any reasonable person would call a plan. She had something far more powerful. She had a reason. Chapter 7: Abuja Building from the Ground. 45 30 54 10. The couple at the Abuja address were named Mr. and Mrs. Bello Abdullahi and Fatima. They ran a small but respected NGO focused on child welfare and education recovery, operating out of a modest office in Garki. Mama Ngozi's letter of introduction was thorough, honest, and written with the moral authority of a woman who had spent her life in service to education. The Bellows read it at their kitchen table the morning after Zara arrived on their doorstep, damp from a brief Abuja rain and clutching her envelope. They were not naive people. They asked Zara careful questions. They listened to the answers, the summarized version, not the full horror, because Zara had already made a private decision never to weaponize her suffering for sympathy, only to use it as fuel for herself. What she told them was sufficient: the bruises on her hands, the bare feet, the birth certificate, the absence of school records beyond primary 2. Fatima Bello served her tea and said, "You will stay with us until we figure out the next step." The next step took shape with a speed that surprised everyone, including Zara, because what no one had yet discovered, what Zara had not yet understood about herself, was that given the right environment, she functioned at an astonishing level. The Bellows arranged for her to sit an assessment examination at an adult education center in Abuja. The center's director, a brisk, skeptical woman named Mrs. Ademi, administered a multi-subject assessment designed to place adults returning to education into appropriate class levels. She expected, based on Zara's background, to place her at primary 6 or junior secondary 1. Zara sat the assessment in 2.5 hours. She was placed directly into SS2 senior secondary year 2. Mrs. Ademi called the Bellows that evening, her voice carrying the specific tone of someone trying to sound measured about something that was not, in fact, fully explicable by their professional frameworks. "I don't know where this girl learned what she knows or how she retains it," she said carefully, "but I would strongly encourage you to ensure she has uninterrupted access to quality education. Immediately." The Bellows enrolled her in a private secondary school in Garki on a bursary the NGO arranged. Zara lived with the Bellows as a ward, and in exchange helped with light household duties not from obligation, but because she was constitutionally incapable of accepting something for nothing, and the Bellows understood that about her quickly. School for Zara was not a relief, it was a reckoning. After years of building an internal library in the dark, suddenly having access to proper teachers, full textbooks, a library of real books, computers, structured curricula, it was as though someone had been fueling a combustion engine in a small container and suddenly gave it room to run at full capacity. She was in every classroom before the teacher arrived. She spent lunch breaks in the library. She borrowed textbooks 2 levels above her class and read them at night. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was making up for lost time, and she had done the arithmetic of exactly how much time there was to make up. She wrote her WAEC examinations at the end of the following academic year. She scored 5 distinctions and 3 credits. The school principal, Mrs. Okoro, called her into the office and told her that her performance was the highest individual score the school had recorded in 11 years. "What do you want to study?" Mrs. Okoro asked. "Law," Zara said. There was no pause, there was no hesitation. There had never been any other answer. She sat jam with a score that put her comfortably into the law program at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, one of the most prestigious law schools in the country. The Bellows wept at the result. Mr. Bellows shook her hand formally, then abandoned formality and embraced her. Fatima could not stop calling her relatives to share the news. Zara was grateful, quietly, deeply, entirely. But she did not allow herself to be overwhelmed by gratitude, because she knew that emotion, like all emotions, was a tool, and tools serve their purpose best when precisely applied. She thanked the Bellows that night and then went to her room and prepared her study schedule for the following 4 years with the same methodical precision she had once applied to memorizing law passages in a dog kennel in Umuahia. University was where Zara Okoro became fully herself. She studied with the precision of someone who understood not just what the law said, but why it said it, the philosophical underpinning, the social context, the historical pressures that had shaped each statute and precedent. Her professors found her simultaneously gratifying and unsettling in the way that genuinely exceptional students can be the ones who not only answer the question, but anticipate the question behind the question. She debated in moot court with a composure and strategic sophistication that made students twice her confidence level step back and reassess their arguments. She wrote academic papers that 2 professors, on separate occasions, told her were publishable. She graduated in the top 1% of her class. She was called to bar with commendation, and she returned to Abuja as a newly qualified lawyer with a specialty in property law, family law, and inheritance rights, which was, of course, no coincidence whatsoever. Within 2 years, she joined one of the top law firms in Abuja, Akafar, Bello and Associates, beginning as a junior associate. Within 4 years, she was handling complex high-value property disputes independently. Within 6, she was appointed junior partner, the youngest the firm had ever made in its 30-year history. She was known in Abuja legal circles for two things: the devastating precision of her research and a quality in court that senior lawyers described, always with a slightly puzzled expression, as calmness that makes the other side nervous. She had never stopped keeping records. For 10 years since the night she escaped the compound, Zara had been building a legal case methodically, patiently, document by document. She had obtained, through formal legal channels, copies of her mother's will, the original property titles registered in Adiz Okoro's name, the inheritance certificates that named Zara as sole beneficiary, and the bank records showing transfers out of accounts legally belonging to Zara's inheritance that had been made without her knowledge or authorization. She had documented the fraud, the illegal property use, the unauthorized financial transactions, and the fundamental legal fact that Victoria and Chief Okoro had been living in, profiting from, and in some cases transferring assets that belonged entirely and legally to Zara Okoro. She built the case the way she had built her internal library in the kennel, systematically, in the dark if necessary, with no one watching, until the moment came to open the door. That moment came on a Tuesday evening when her phone rang and the caller, an old Umuahia neighbor she had quietly stayed in contact with through a third party, told her that Victoria had begun approaching a real estate agent in Abuja about selling the Umuahia compound. They were finally, apparently, becoming nervous about time, about Zara showing up, about the law catching up to them. Zara set down her phone, sat in her office in the Garki law firm for a long time in complete silence, and then picked up her phone again and called the court. It was time. Chapter 8. The case is filed. 54-1061-20. The filing of a legal case is, on the surface, a procedurally mundane thing: forms completed, fees paid, documents submitted, dates assigned. From the outside, it looks like administration. From the inside of the case Zara had been building for a decade, it felt like the moment a river that has been gathering force underground finally breaks through the surface into open air. Zara instructed a trusted colleague to handle the formal filing to maintain appropriate professional distance, but she authored every document personally, in the evenings and on weekends, in her Abuja apartment, where the walls of the study were lined with bookshelves that looked to the casual visitor remarkably like a small library. Which, of course, was the point. The case was filed at the Abia State High Court, Okoro v. Okoro and Ors. Zara Okoro as plaintiff, her father and stepmother as first and second defendants, with a supporting fraud claim against the financial institution that had facilitated several unauthorized account transfers. The filing included 17 exhibits: property documents, bank records, death certificates, the original will, certified copies of inheritance titles, and a sworn affidavit from a former compound employee who had been located after a careful search and was willing to testify about conditions she had personally witnessed. It also included a preservation order application, a request for the court to immediately freeze any property transactions involving the listed assets pending the resolution of the matter. This was critical. Victoria's conversation with the real estate agent suggested she was moving. Zara needed to move faster. The preservation order was granted within 72 hours. A court-appointed registrar delivered the notice to the compound in Umuahia on a Thursday afternoon. Zara knew the precise moment it arrived because the old neighbor who served as her quiet contact called her at 3:14 in the afternoon. "Victoria has gone completely inside," the neighbor reported, her voice low and satisfied. "Chief Okoro is packing the veranda like a mad person. Two lawyers arrived 20 minutes later. The whole street is talking. Zara thanked her contact, ended the call, and went back to preparing for an entirely unrelated client's court appearance the following morning. She had long since learned that the best revenge was not impatience. It was preparation. The case moved through the court system with the particular urgency that a preservation order tends to generate. Victoria and Chief Okoro retained their own legal team, a senior Aba-based firm that Zara knew by reputation and respected sufficiently to be thorough about anticipating their arguments. They filed defenses claiming that Zara had abandoned the household voluntarily, that the property transfers had been authorized, that the will had been improperly registered, and that Chief Okoro, as surviving spouse, had rights that superseded the inheritance provisions. Zara sat in her apartment and read each defense filing with the same quiet, concentrated attention she had given to Mama Ngozi's law books in a sitting room 2 decades earlier. Then she prepared her responses, each one precise, legally airtight, and systematically dismantling the opposing arguments piece by piece, with the patient thoroughness of someone who has had a very long time to think about exactly this. The hearing date was set. Zara applied for leave to appear in the matter personally, in addition to her instructed colleague, given her professional standing. The application was granted. She drove to Umuahia the day before the hearing. Not to the compound, not yet. She went to Mama Ngozi first. The old woman was 81 now, slightly more bent, the tomato plants in the yard smaller and fewer, the newspapers she received daily a day old instead of fresh. But her eyes, behind the perpetual reading glasses, were as sharp as they had always been. She opened the gate when she heard the knock 3, paused 2, and looked at Zara for a long moment. "You came back," Mama Ngozi said. "I came back," Zara confirmed. They sat in the book-filled sitting room, the same room where a 14-year-old with muddy feet had once run her finger across a Form 2 English textbook like it was the most sacred object she had ever touched, and they talked for 2 hours. About everything. About all of it. When the 2 hours were over, Mama Ngozi walked Zara to the gate and held both her hands. "Go in tomorrow," the old woman said, "and do not be afraid." "I am not afraid," Zara said. "I know," said Mama Ngozi. "That is why you will win." Chapter 9: The Day of Reckoning. 61-2070-40. The Abia State High Court in Umuahia was not an imposing building by architectural standards, a 2-story cream-colored structure with a wide parking area, and a row of neem trees along the front fence that gave it a slightly provincial air. But courts derive their authority not from their buildings but from what happens inside them. And on the morning that Okoro v. Okoro and Ors was called, the gallery was unusually full. Word had traveled, as it always does in Nigerian communities, in the specific way that stories involving compound secrets and a wealthy man's disgrace always travel through the networks of neighbors, church groups, market women, and people who remembered the little girl who used to be locked in the kennel at the back of the Okoro compound. Some had come out of curiosity. Some had come out of something closer to conscience. A few had simply come because they had seen the child suffer and wanted to see with their own eyes how the story ended. Zara arrived at 8:15, 45 minutes before the scheduled hearing. She wore her lawyer's robes over a perfectly tailored white shirt, her hair pinned back precisely, her shoes reflecting the light from the corridor floor. She walked through the building with the unhurried, absolute certainty of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be doing exactly what they were built to do. She was arranging her documents at the plaintiff's table when Victoria and Chief Okoro entered with their legal team. Victoria saw her immediately. She stopped walking. For a single moment, every performance she had ever constructed, the glamour, the authority, the cruelty dressed up as discipline fell away, and what appeared in its place was pure, cold fear. She aged 10 years in that single instant of recognition. Chief Okoro stopped beside her. He looked at his daughter, at the woman his daughter had become, and his expression moved through several things in quick succession. Shock, shame, something briefly resembling grief, and then a blankness that suggested he had decided numbness was safer than feeling. Zara looked at them both once, calmly, the way you look at exhibits in a case you have already prepared for thoroughly. Then she turned back to her documents. The hearing lasted 3 days. Zara presented her case with a methodical precision that the court reporter would later describe to his supervisor as unlike anything in 15 years of transcribing proceedings. She walked the court through the documented evidence of her mother's will and the property registrations. She presented the bank records showing unauthorized withdrawals from accounts held in Zara's name. She called the former compound employee, who testified, her hands shaking but her voice steady, about the conditions she had witnessed: the kennel, the beatings, the burning of books. She entered into evidence records from Mama Ngozi, the adult education center, the secondary school, and the University of Nigeria, all documenting the existence of Zara Okoro, her education, her character, and the life she had built in the absence of any support from the defendants. She remained calm throughout. When opposing counsel raised objections, she addressed them without visible emotion. When the defense made arguments, she waited for them to finish completely before responding, always precisely, always with supporting citations, never with theatrical display. Her argument was so thoroughly documented and logically organized that, by the end of the second day, the opposing legal team had grown visibly quieter. The presiding judge, Justice Nwachukwu, was a measured, experienced jurist who had seen many things in his career. He asked pointed questions of both sides. He studied the documents submitted. He listened to submissions and responses. At one point during cross-examination, he stopped the proceedings to ask Zara directly, "Counsel, you are yourself a party to this matter. How do you ensure objectivity in your own presentation?" Zara considered the question for exactly 3 seconds. "My lord," she said, "objectivity requires evidence. I have presented evidence. It is for the court to be objective. I simply present the facts as they exist." Justice Nwachukwu looked at her over his glasses for a moment, then nodded once and said, "Proceed." On the morning of the third day, the judge delivered his ruling. The gallery was silent. The neem trees outside were still. Even the Lagos-bound traffic beyond the court fence seemed to hold its breath. Justice Nwachukwu read from his written judgment in the steady, deliberate voice of a man who had thought carefully about every word. He found that the will of the late Mrs. Adiz Okoro was valid, properly registered, and legally unambiguous. He found that the properties listed: the Umuahia compound, the Aba property, the palm oil farmlands, and the associated business shares and investment accounts, had been lawfully bequeathed to Zara Okoro as sole beneficiary, and that this status had never been altered by any legal instrument. He found that the defendants had occupied and operated these properties without legal authority. He found, on the basis of the bank records and documentation submitted, that funds belonging to Zara Okoro's inheritance had been used, transferred, and in some cases depleted by the defendants without any legal authorization, a finding that constituted fraud under the relevant statutes. He ordered full eviction of the defendants from the Umuahia compound within 48 hours. He ordered the immediate restoration of all registered properties to Zara Okoro. He ordered a financial audit of all business accounts and investment instruments with restitution of depleted funds to be assessed and ordered at a subsequent hearing. He ordered the matter referred to the relevant authorities for consideration of criminal fraud charges. He picked up the gavel. The gallery exhaled all at once. The gavel came down. "This court is adjourned." In the row behind the defendant's table, someone began clapping a single set of hands, then 2, then several more, until the bailiff raised his hand for order and the room stilled again. But the sound had already happened. It could not be unhappened. Victoria sat at the defendant's table with her face in her hands. Her shoulders were shaking. Chief Okoro sat perfectly still, staring at nothing. Zara gathered her documents from the plaintiff's table slowly, carefully, organized the way she always organized everything. She slid them into her leather briefcase. She closed the clasp. She stood up. She did not look at the defendant's table. She walked out of the courtroom into the corridor and stood for a moment in the quiet, holding her briefcase, breathing the slightly dusty air of a Nigerian court building on a warm Wednesday morning. Then she walked out through the front door, into the sunlight. Chapter 10, 48 hours. 70, 40, 77, 50. The 48 hours Victoria and Chief Okoro had been given to vacate the compound passed in the compound. The way storms pass loudly, confusingly, in a state of disorganized urgency that bore no resemblance to the careful planning they had spent years congratulating themselves on. Victoria called her relatives from Enugu. They came 3 sisters and 2 brothers-in-law and stood in the compound speaking rapidly in low voices, looking at the court order document that had been posted on the compound gate as though it might be a mistake, as though reading it carefully enough might reveal an error or an escape route. There was no error. There was no escape route. Her lawyers made several urgent applications to stay the eviction order. Each one was addressed, considered, and rejected within the timeframe of the order itself. The legal case was comprehensive. The documentation was complete. There was no procedural crack large enough to provide meaningful shelter. Zara did not return to the compound during those 48 hours. She had already been there in the legal sense in every document she had filed. She spent the time at a hotel in Umuahia, working on her existing Abuja caseload, responding to client emails, preparing submissions for a separate property matter that needed her attention in 2 weeks. She was not waiting for the drama of the eviction. She had already done what she came to do. On the morning the 48 hours expired, she drove to the compound in the black Mercedes. The security officers she had hired, a formal enforcement team authorized by the court order, arrived in a separate vehicle behind her. The compound gate was open. Neighbors had gathered on the street in small, quiet clusters, watching. Some of the older ones women who had known Adiz, neighbors who had been here long enough to remember a small girl with plaited hair being locked behind a back gate, stood a little apart from the others, watching with expressions that were past curiosity, past judgment, settling into something more like witness. Victoria and Chief Okoro were in the main parlor when Zara entered. Victoria was dressed as though for wore full makeup, good jewelry, her most authoritative wrapper. She had decided, apparently, to face this with performance intact. Chief Okoro sat on the sofa in a loose agbada, his hands on his knees. He looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with age. Zara walked into the parlor, set her briefcase on the side table, and stood in the center of the room. She looked at the room, the high ceiling, the tiled floor, the expensive furniture, the large photograph of her father and Victoria on the wall. She looked at all of it without visible emotion. "The 48 hours are complete," she said. "The officers outside will begin supervising the removal of your personal property. Anything belonging to the estate of Adiz Okoro or to the listed properties remains here." Victoria stood up. Zara. Her voice had been stripped of cruelty, which left it sounding oddly hollow, like a drum with nothing inside. "Zara, we are your family, whatever mistakes were made." "You burned my school books," Zara said quietly. "You pulled me out of school at age 8. You locked me in a dog kennel every night for 10 years. You planned to steal my mother's entire estate and then arranged for me to be disposed of when I was no longer useful. The court has heard all of this. The documentation exists. You will have the opportunity to answer for it in criminal proceedings that are being considered." She paused. "I am not interested in a conversation about family." Victoria's composure, which had held barely through the court proceedings, through the 48-hour siege of phone calls and lawyer visits and crying relatives, cracked entirely. She fell to her knees on the tiled floor of the parlor, her hands pressed together, tears running in black mascara lines down her face. "After everything we did for you," she wept. "We housed you, we fed you, we—" "You housed me in a kennel," Zara said. Her voice remained level. Not cold, exactly, something more complicated than cold. Resolved. Final. The voice of someone who has said goodbye to something and does not need to say it again. "You fed me what was left after the dogs. You planned my disappearance. These things are documented. Weeping does not undocument them." Chief Okoro had not spoken. He sat on the sofa with his hands on his knees and looked at his daughter with an expression that had aged him visibly in the space of 10 minutes. Something in his eyes was trying to form itself into a word, an apology perhaps, or an explanation, or simply a plea for recognition, for the acknowledgement that somewhere beneath the years of cowardice and complicity there remained something that had once loved her. Zara looked at him for a long moment. "I am not here for an apology," she said quietly, just to him, just between the two of them. "And I am not here for a reconciliation. I am here because my mother built this with her own hands and her own intelligence and her own love, and she left it to me. I have come to take what belongs to me. That is all." She picked up her briefcase. She walked to the door of the parlor. She stopped without turning around. "The kennel at the back of the compound will be cleaned and restored for Brutus and King," she said. "I trust they have been fed properly throughout this process. Their welfare is not subject to this dispute." She walked out. Chapter 11. What she found in the kennel. 77 50 83 20. After the security officers had completed the supervised removal, and the compound was officially under new management, a property manager, appointed by Zara's firm to oversee the transition, Zara did something that none of the officers or legal staff accompanying her expected. She walked alone to the back of the compound. The kennel was still there, of course it was. It was a fixed structure, permanent and solid in the way only the instruments of cruelty seemed to be. It was older now, rustier in certain sections, the metal gate darker with years of weather. The concrete pad it sat on had developed cracks that crawled in the lines of something between accident and pattern. Brutus and King were both gone. Dogs do not live for 10 years without attention, and the compound staff had informed her they had been rehomed by a neighbor 2 years earlier when Victoria began neglecting their care. She noted this information without visible response. Zara stood in front of the kennel for a long time. It was smaller than she remembered. This happens sometimes with the architecture of childhood trauma. You return expecting enormity and find instead that time has shrunk it, that what held a universe of suffering in memory is, in physical fact, a modest iron structure in the back corner of an ordinary compound. The kennel was perhaps 2.5 meters by 2 meters. It smelled still, faintly, of metal and damp, and the particular sourness of an enclosed space that has held too much. But it was smaller than the space it had occupied in her memory for a decade. She reached out and put her hand on the gate. The gate swung open. The chain was long gone. Inside, the concrete floor was dirty with leaves and old debris. The gap in the wall where she had hidden the metal file was still there, still invisible unless you knew precisely where to look. She crouched down and looked through the gate into the interior of the space where she had spent 10 years of her life. She looked at it steadily, without flinching, without ceremony, with the unflinching regard of someone who has done enough therapy internal, because she had done it herself, in hotel rooms and in the quiet hours before dawn. With the same systematic thoroughness, she applied to everything to be able to look directly at the worst thing without being swallowed by it. She thought about Brutus pressing his warm side against hers in the harmattan cold. She thought about King licking her wrist the night she said goodbye. She thought about whispering sections of the Nigerian Constitution to 2 German shepherds in the darkness, and the way a tail thumping against concrete can feel, in the right circumstances, like the most generous kindness the world has to offer. She stood up. She pulled the gate closed. She went back to the main compound and made a phone call to a contractor she had already identified, who would begin the following week converting the rear section of the property, including the former kennel site, into a small community reading library, open to children in the surrounding area, specifically free of charge for any child whose family could not afford fees. She had been planning this for 3 years. She had already selected the initial book collection. She had already arranged for a retired teacher she had thought, briefly, of asking Mama Ngozi, but Mama Ngozi was 81 and deserved to rest to serve as part-time librarian. The library would be called, in the painted sign above its door, the Adiz Okoro Reading Room. Her mother's name, in the place where they had tried to make her mother's daughter disappear. It was, Zara thought, the most precise kind of justice available. Chapter 12, The Woman She Became. 83, 2085-00. On the drive back out through the compound gates, through the same iron gates she had walked through in bare feet and torn clothes a decade earlier, through the same gates she had re-entered carrying the envelope that contained a decade's worth of patient, meticulous, legally airtight work, Zara glanced in her rearview mirror. The compound receded, the gates closed. The compound wall shrank to a rectangle, then to a line, then to nothing. A single tear ran down her left cheek. Not from grief, not from triumph, not even from relief, exactly, though relief was part of it. It was something older and quieter than any of those things. It was the particular feeling of a circle completing itself, a long, irregular, painful, brilliant circle that had begun in the rain beside a rusted kennel gate and ended in a courtroom and a rear-view mirror on a dusty Umuahia road. She had been 8 years old when the world broke. She had been 16 when she escaped with nothing but her mind. She had been in her 20s when she built, piece by careful piece, the life and the case, and the woman she had decided on a night in the dark with 2 dogs pressed against her cold arms that she would become. She had come back. She had won. Not loudly, not dramatically, with documents and preparation and the kind of patient, irresistible determination that cannot be burned, chained, beaten, or locked in the dark, because it lives in a place that cruelty cannot reach. The road ahead was long and bright and entirely hers. She pressed the accelerator. She drove. 85, 0085 45. End screen. And that, friends, is the complete story of Zara Okoro, a girl who was locked in a kennel and came back with a court order, a child who was denied books and built a library in her mind, a daughter who was betrayed by the people who owed her protection and protected herself by becoming unstoppable. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that resilience is real and justice is possible, and that no circumstance, no matter how permanent it seems, has the last word, please like this video and share it with someone today. Subscribe with notifications on, because every single week we bring you stories like this one. True life, inspired stories of people who were counted out and came back for everything. Drop your comments below. Tell us what part of Zara's story hit you hardest. Would you have gone back? Would you have built the library? Thank you for watching. The next story drops in 2